Member for Courtenay-Alberni.
Mr. Speaker, for thousands of years, salmon has been the foundation and main food source of the Nuu-chah-nulth Nations. Over the last 8 years, their basic rights to catch and sell fish in their traditional territory has been upheld by the BC Supreme Court and the Supreme Court of Canada. Mr. Speaker, yet after promising not to fight First Nations in court, this Liberal government is still refusing to honour these rights. And Mr. Speaker, I just want to run down the timeline so that it's on record here in this House. In November 3rd, 2009, Justice Garson of the BC Supreme Court ruled that the Nuu-chah-nulth First Nations have an Aboriginal right to harvest and sell all species of fish found within their territories. Justice Garson ordered Canada to negotiate with the nations about how to accommodate their right within its management of the fisheries. In July 2010, the nations developed community-based fishing plans for rights-based fisheries. In August 2010, DFO rejected the nation's proposals, and on May 18, 2011, the BC Court of Appeal unanimously affirmed the right of the 5 Nuu-chah-nulth nations to harvest and sell any species of fish in their territories, with the exception of geoduck clams. In August 2011, Canada applied to the Supreme Court of Canada for leave, for permission to appeal the decision of the BC Court of Appeal. And in March 2012, the Supreme Court of Canada did not grant Canada's application for leave to appeal, but sent the case back to the BC Court of Appeal for re-examination in light of the recent court ruling of the Lax-Kw'alaams versus Canada. Later, in July 2013, the BC Court of Appeal unanimously affirmed that the nations have Aboriginal rights to harvest and sell all species, again, fish except for geoduck. And in September 2013, Canada asked for leave for appeal to the 2009 decision to the Supreme Court of Canada. In January 2014, the Supreme Court of Canada denied the application, meaning that the Declaration of Aboriginal Right is final and the nation's rights are protected under Section 35 of Canada's Constitution. And on March 9, 2015, the Nuu-chah-nulth First Nations returned to court for a justification trial, at which time Canada attempted to justify why the Nuu-chah-nulth nations are not previously or historically given the right to harvest and sell all species of fish in their territories. And Canada provide evidence first, and Nuu-chah-nulth witnesses give their evidence after. Mr. Speaker, on October 28, 2016, the justification trial ended after 144 days of the justification trial. And here we are in December 2017, and the nations are waiting the decision of the trial. But throughout this whole period, Mr. Speaker, they've demonstrated patience this whole time. They want to be out fishing. They don't want to be in court, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to read a quote today. It's a media release from today, and it's from the Takwiak Fisheries. And the Takwiak Fisheries refers to the fishing with permission of the Hatwiya, of the hereditary chiefs. And this is from. It's a quote, and it's about their frustration of inaction from the government. It's from the lead negotiator for the Ahousaht Nation, Cliff Atleo, and he says, "Our fishers have been waiting since 2009 to fish and sell all species in our territories, which the courts, all the way to the Supreme Court, confirmed is our right." He says again, "This government has been in power for 2 years now, and we have yet to see any real evidence of the new relationship promised by the Prime Minister. They talk a lot about reconciliation with First Nations. Well, it's time to prove it, Mr. Speaker. This government says their most important relationship is Canada's Indigenous people. Why are they fighting them in court?"
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to start by saying, as somebody that was born in Comox, it was my pleasure at the invitation of the member opposite to visit Courtenay-Alberni, go back to Vancouver Island, meet with local, municipal, community and Indigenous leaders. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, a renewed nation-to-nation relationship with Indigenous peoples based on recognition of rights, respect, cooperation and partnership is a top priority for our government. The federal government is supportive of the rights of the 5 Nuu-chah-nulth First Nations and remains committed to the consultation negotiation process and in accommodating and implementing the rights of First Nations. In its decision dated November 3rd, 2009, as the member opposite referred to, the Supreme Court of British Columbia found that the 5 Nuu-chah-nulth bands on the west coast of Vancouver Island have an Aboriginal right to fish for any species of fish within their fishing territories, which extends offshore 9 miles, and to sell that fish. On appeal, the Court of Appeal for British Columbia excluded geoduck from the scope of this Aboriginal right. The decision also found that the First Nations have a right to fish using their preferred means, which the courts characterize as community-based, localized fisheries involving wide community participation and using small, low-cost boats. Consultations and negotiations with the 5 First Nations have been ongoing since 2010. Following the establishment of the right, the parties set up a substantive consultation and negotiation process that was modeled on treaty negotiations, with a main table for negotiations and a joint working group for technical discussions to work with the First Nations to address outstanding fisheries issues. The matters that are subject of negotiation are inherently complex. One of the significant challenges of these ongoing negotiations is that there's a different view on the scope of the right, which was described by the court as a right to sell fish into the commercial marketplace, but not on an industrial scale. Since 2010, significant fishing access has been provided to the First Nations. For example, in 2007, First Nations had 23 commercial licenses. They now have over 126 licenses and additional quota, have access to over 126 licenses, Mr. Speaker. In 2015, to help guide the discussions, an evaluation framework was developed to continue implementation of the court's decision and enable DFO and the First Nations to further test and evaluate the accommodation of preferred means fishing through local small boat fishery approaches for Chinook salmon and other species of interest to the First Nations. At the request of the 5 Nuu-chah-nulth First Nations, a new negotiating process was launched in March of 2017, so earlier this spring, Mr. Speaker. The 5 First Nations and federal officials have completed a framework agreement in order to initiate and guide the negotiation of a reconciliation agreement. These reconciliation negotiations are without prejudice and are intended to assist the parties in more freely presenting their interests and exploring potential solutions. The recently established process will help develop a common understanding of our respective views and in assisting us in finding mutually agreeable resolutions to outstanding issues. I can assure that this government is committed to working with the First Nations through the current consultation and negotiation processes to accommodate and implement the rights of the 5 Nuu-chah-nulth First Nations. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Courtenay-Alberni.
Mr. Speaker, I do want to thank the member for coming to my riding. He did come, and it was great. He heard from people, he heard from the nations, how important these rights and this settlement is to the Nuu-chah-nulth people. He heard how much we need coastal restoration funds in the SOMAS, and what we got was nothing for coastal restoration funds for the SOMAS. What the Nuu-chah-nulth people got was nothing in terms of something concrete at the table, at the negotiating table, and they're still waiting for that, Mr. Speaker. The speech that I just heard actually minimizes really the rights and again diminishes the call to action from the Nuu-chah-nulth people. And I really hope that the member is actually listening, that I'm here on behalf of the Nuu-chah-nulth people, asked for them to bring their voice to the House of Commons. And I will just read a quick statement from the chief from the Heshquit Nation. He says, well, 2 years in government, this government it's been long enough to back up their words with real action that will make a difference to our communities. We have been patient and willing to work with government. Our fishers and communities are living in poverty with unacceptable levels of unemployment. Yet right out in front of our own communities are fishing jobs waiting for our people. If this government will get on with it and do the right thing like they keep saying they will do, it'll make a difference, Mr. Speaker. And I hope this member is really listening today. They are saying nothing concrete has been put on the table.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A renewed nation-to-nation relationship with Indigenous peoples based on recognition of rights, respect, cooperation, and partnership is a top priority for our government. Our government remains committed to the consultation and negotiation process and accommodating and implementing the rights of the 5 Nuu-chah-nulth First Nations. At the request of the 5 Nuu-chah-nulth First Nations, a new negotiating process was launched in March 2017. Through this process, the 5 First Nations and federal officials have completed a framework agreement which will guide the negotiations of a reconciliation agreement. These reconciliation negotiations are without prejudice and are intended to assist the parties in more freely presenting their interests and exploring potential solutions. The matters that are the subject of the negotiations are inherently complex, but I can assure that this government is committed to working with the First Nations through the current consultations and negotiations process to accommodate and implement their rights. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.